the presentation. Bienvenidos a la Casa de España. Welcome to the House of Spain. Some people may say, why are you doing it in English, Jesus? We're always with this problem. Dr. Scott Dale, he's a professor at the University of Marquette University on the East Coast. Él habla español muy bien, but he has the presentation in English, and he's the one that he gives in classes in the schools. So it was much faster and better for us, and I asked him, no, just do it in English. It should be no problem, because most people here know English, and a couple maybe have a little problem with Spanish. So it's going to be in English. Dr. Dale, he was born in California. He's a native of Orange County. So how many here were born in California? Oh, Henry. So, also Diana. Okay, so you have good company, Scott. When he was, I believe, about 20 years old, he went to Spain, and he fell in love with Spain and the history, and even with the Spanish woman. Gema is his wife over here. Ella es madrileña, and if you don't know her, we can talk later on with a little sangria and some appetizers that she brought. She wanted to do that. I said, great, so let's work for us. So, Dr. Dale has a huge list of accomplishments at universities, publishing books, publishing articles and all of that. I'm not going to read that. If you are interested, I can always give you the web page where all his credits are in there. So with that, I would like to introduce Scott. Welcome, and welcome to the House of Spain.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Jesus mentioned that I was born in California, and you might be thinking, oh, I feel at home. But I have been gone for so long that I feel like I am on vacation. Because when I was 20, as Jesus mentioned, I just knew in my heart that I needed to go visit other cultures. When I left, and my father left me at the airport in LA, I remember him saying, hasta la vista? It was not very clear where my road was leading. And since that year, that was 1990, I believe, I've really never come home only to visit. So I'm here, but I still feel like I'm a pirate visiting ports all over the world. So if my voice is too low, raise your hand. I want to make sure that I'm clear. Am I good?
Yeah, I think that you are perfect.
Okay, because
He's too loud.
Okay, I'm too loud. That's the first time anybody has ever said that. Because my wife has the vocal cords. That's for sure. So thank you very much, Jesus, for making this happen. That really is something I'll never forget, and it was really great meeting you, Pedro. Pedro was very helpful setting all this up, and I really appreciate that. So hello everybody, I am Scott Dale, and I just wanted to thank you once again for taking time out of your busy schedules to reflect a little bit about the Enlightenment, the 18th century in Spain, and why we might want to appreciate it more. You might be asking, who cares about 18th century Spain, and why am I even here today listening to some esoteric talk about the 18th century? Well, the sad truth is that the Spanish 18th century has historically been like the neglected stepchild of a backwoods family in the middle of nowhere. As we can see in recent Spanish newspapers, this is from about 2 months ago in the ABC, teaching the 18th century is again being threatened to be overlooked, shunned, ignored, and deleted into the spam mailboxes of contemporary Spanish consciousness. Misunderstood, and it's still a real challenge to shed more light on such an interesting and meaningful period in Spanish history. It's too bad that the 1700s in Spain are still overlooked, marginalized, and misunderstood. To put it another way, if the Spanish 18th century had an Instagram page, it would probably have about 4 followers. Me, my wife, one of my more accomplished students, and maybe a fake follower, and maybe Jesus. So with that said, your time today is important, and I'm happy that you decided to stop by, especially on such a beautiful day. I'm really looking forward to sharing my thoughts about my passion for the inspiring Spanish Enlightenment as seen in my next slide, Goya's famous portrait of Jovellanos at his desk. And this is my favorite image of the 18th century. I always use this in class because it really encapsulates the spirit of the Spanish Enlightenment. So, again, thank you to Jesus and the House of Spain and all of the members of the Board of Directors for allowing me to share my passion with all of you today. So first I'd like to tell you a bit about myself, who I am, where I come from, and why I enjoy thinking about the Enlightenment, and how I connect to this intellectual period in Spanish history. Because if you were to meet me on the street, I don't think you'd be thinking that I was a specialist in the Spanish 18th century. You might think I'm probably in a different field. But the 18th century might not be your first choice. So I grew up in Southern California, as Jesus said, near a Spanish mission, the mission of San Juan Capistrano. So this is really my neighborhood. And this is where the swallows fly from Argentina every March. I was an only child, and I remember spending much of my youth thinking about the Spanish mission and the Spanish colonists that had lived basically in the same neighborhood that I lived in 200 years before. Many of their trails and roads are still near my neighborhood today. I used to think about how they built that mission without blueprints and modern cement mixers, and how they constructed the roads and all the other logistical challenges that the Spanish colonists must have had in the late 18th century. Being an only child with working parents, I remember thinking a lot about what Spaniards must have had to struggle with without the tools and technology that we have today. I used to look at street signs in my neighborhood, and I was always surprised that almost every street name where I grew up had Spanish names, like Villa Conquista, Vista Grande, Del Obispo, Del Prado, Vista del Mar, etc. These are all real streets. Obviously, we can see them on Google Maps. So for you Spanish colonists out there listening, I grew up near the railroad tracks in Alta California. So my natural attraction to 18th century Spanish culture and history is evident because it was all around me. Spanish culture and language seemed to be my calling because I had so many questions and so much curiosity about the people who lived in my neighborhood over 2 centuries earlier. And I remember asking when I was really young, hey, where'd all the Spaniards go? But in addition to my curiosity for Spanish culture, I was also kind of an industrious kid because I enjoyed figuring things out on my own. For example, I enjoyed thinking of all the possible recipes you could imagine with peanut butter, bread, and celery. Or, how can I fix a broken window before my parents come home? Without the proper tools, I used to think about how I could rely on myself to fix problems. I remember building my own skateboard with basic tools, and I remember fixing my tennis shoes with a needle and thread. For whatever reason, I just remember using my own mental capacity, my 5 senses, to figure things out. A funny example of when I really had to figure things out on my own without a book of instructions or any special tool was when I was working at my after-school job, I was 13, I used to clean a fishing boat, and after it returned from a full day of fishing, I had a problem. It was my responsibility to clean the smelly boat with a brush, and one day I realized that a large California brown pelican got stuck upside down in the bait tank, and I looked at the pelican and I realized that before my boss returned, I had to remove the pelican from the bait tank all by myself. I'm sure you've all seen a pelican. They're big and they're nasty, and they have a big hook on the end of their beak, and they can really hurt you. So without any known remove the pelican from the bait tank manual around, I figured out that the best way to remove the pelican was to find a net and build a contraption that would safely remove the pelican so I could finally go home. And I remember moving that pelican without hurting it and without me getting hurt, and I felt good that I figured it out all by myself. In my youth, I remember projects and challenges that involved creativity and curiosity and the need to fix and resolve issues. So I think one of the main reasons why I was attracted to the Spanish Enlightenment was my affinity to an intellectual movement that celebrated the capacity to use science, math, and problem-solving skills. I was no inventor and I was no genius, but it is empowering to use the intellect to solve problems without a manual, an app, or a book of instructions. For me, the Enlightenment seemed to explore these same experiences. The Spanish Enlightenment is a period in which we learn about pioneers of intellectual capacity to find solutions and seek better ways for the human experience. As we can see in this infamous portrait of Carlos III, the 18th century monarch was one of the very few Spanish kings who defended the will to seek social progress and intellectual achievements and advancements. In my opinion, the Spanish Enlightenment is not only a celebration of achievements of the human intellect, but it is also a period that connects well with today's society, in that self-reliance, independence, and confidence in one's intellectual ability can be the path to positive self-esteem and empowerment. So, why do I spend my time thinking about the Spanish Enlightenment? It's because the Enlightenment is about self-discovery, self-reliance, and creating a path to happiness. So, last month I had this talk prepared and all ready to go. For the first time, I was ahead of the game. I actually had all my talks and classes prepared well in advance. And I was thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just this past month, after browsing the headlines in a major Spanish newspaper, it hit me that I needed to revise this talk. And so just a few days ago, in the Spanish newspaper that I had up here earlier, we had this announcement of what's happening with the Ministro de Educación. They're both recommending that public high school Spanish history courses would no longer cover material prior to 1812 as historical modules. This is a very polemic issue, and the idea of eliminating core courses covering history in Spain before 1812 is on the table. So, high school history courses could now start in 1812 with only brief mention of prior events such as the economic, social, and religious events in the 16th and 17th centuries. And I thought, after reading this article just last month, yes, the 18th century will now really be the forgotten century if this is approved. While one Spanish region, Murcia, is protesting, the Spanish Ministry of Education argues that basic historical knowledge of after 1812 is sufficient. In other words, Spanish history after 1812 would be sufficient for most students in public high schools. Now, they're arguing that this is enough for the development of historical knowledge of Spain. Surprisingly, this would mean that the prior public educational model referred to as the work law would be totally transformed, and public high school history courses would no longer include the study of Spain's encounter with the Americas, the history of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, the medieval period, the Golden Age, and sadly, my favorite period, the Spanish Enlightenment. This proposed Lomoe plan, popularly known as the Tela Reformative Plan, would allow brief mention of certain examples of events prior to 1812, but only to demonstrate an economic topic. For example, owning land in the medieval period, the old guard monarchies to discuss social protests, or the Catholic Church to discuss religion. However, under the proposed high school plan by the Spanish Ministry of Education and the Spanish Royal Academy of History, the development of ideology, intellectual development, philosophical trends, and the advancement of the humanities in celebrated periods such as the underrepresented 18th century would be virtually eliminated. The future generation of Spaniards, today's high school students, would have even less awareness and knowledge of the intellectual accomplishment and progress attained during the 1700s in Spain. It would be like sweeping the Enlightenment right under the rug. So why the changes to public high school curricula? The Spanish Ministry of Education argues that in history courses, it would serve students best not to include discussions about not so great moments in Spanish history, such as violence, sexism, patriarchy, abusive monarchies, the Inquisition, religious exile, etc., especially during the medieval period. Or even discussion of Sevilla. I think we have a Sevillana in the house.
Yes. Dos, we have two.
And 2.5. Hema thinks she's Sevillana. So,
More.
okay, I'm sorry, we have those guys. So during the, or even discussion of Sevilla during the Carlos V period. So this would also be eliminated from the Spanish curriculum. The Ministry of Education argues currently that it would be too painful and polarizing for current students in Spain to cover these dark moments in Spanish history. As in the past, the forgotten century, the 18th century, will again be left abandoned, disregarded, underappreciated, misunderstood, and ignored. Very familiar feelings for me as a specialist in Spain of the 1700s. In fact, when I arrived at my university, Marquette University, 23 years ago, I recall a funny moment, and I was 29 years old at the time. And I remember asking one of my new colleagues if any of our courses covered the 18th century. And I remember being told, well, Scott, in one course, we cover a couple of 18th century textual fragments, but we can get through that in about 2 weeks. I remember how fast my heart started to race, my blood pressure quickly rising, and the difficulty I had in continuing to smile with my new colleague. I'll never forget it. There's no hard feelings now. I have moved on, kind of. I think we're in a better place now. But seriously, I had serious questions about the 18th century and how we were going to include that in our own curriculum. So almost 2 decades ago, I started to use a great Spanish culture book published by a major editorial and written about 20 years ago by a very competent author educated in Spain. She is now a teacher in the United States. This immense text that I use in my classes eloquently covers history, culture, and literature of Spain, and I am very happy to share it with my students. In fact, it's one of my favorite books. Even though I absolutely love how the text flows, how it presents complicated issues about Spain, and how it selects the most representative text in Spanish history, there is just one sentence in the book that just boils my blood. And it's the first sentence that comes to mind whenever I see the book on my desk. At the very beginning of the chapter dedicated to the 18th century, this author writes, and I'm translating from the Spanish. She writes, "Now, you've probably never heard too much about the 18th century. In this century, there were no great authors or figures. The 18th century is perceived as mediocre and gray with little interest." My blood still boils when I read this, but it's been very inspiring for me as a Hispanist. In reality, the 18th century is very important if we want to better understand contemporary Spain. Now, while most of us already know about Spain's contribution to traditional cuisine, such as chorizo, jamón ibérico, jerez, the Spanish omelet, the tortilla de patatas, chocolate con churros, and chupa chups. Did you also know that the 18th century Spain has contributed much more in regards to chemical discoveries, scientific inventions, and cultural contributions? Yes, there is much more to Spain than bullfighting, siestas, flamenco, Antonio Banderas, Fada, and Barcelona's tiki-taka soccer. For example, the rare metal tungsten, or wolfram, was a chemical element discovered by Spanish chemists in the 18th century. This is the chemical represented by the letter W. The 18th century Spaniard Antonio de Ulloa discovered platinum, and during the same century, Maria Andrea Casamayor developed the first modern concept of the internship called tirocinio. Many innovative discoveries and scientific accomplishments occurred in 18th century Spain, yet historians and academics could do a much better job highlighting these important cultural and intellectual achievements. This innovative spirit and industrious activity during the Spanish Enlightenment is also mirrored in more contemporary inventions and discoveries in Spain, such as the modern submarine, the digital calculator, the telescope, the cable car, the classical guitar, the modern spacesuit, the wheelchair, the pencil sharpener, neuroscience, the stapler, and my favorite, the mop, la escuela. All Spanish inventions. And let's not forget that 12 years ago, even the state of Wisconsin, where I teach, decided to spend millions of public dollars to purchase reliable Talgo trains, an innovative train system designed and built in Spain. The Republican Scott Walker later canceled the train project, but the fact that an American state selected a Spanish train builder for our transportation need speaks to Spanish innovation and design even in contemporary times. Aside from its numerous scientific and technological innovations, the Spanish 18th century is also known as a liberal and intellectual movement with the goal of clarifying the idea of Spain with symbols and language. During the monarchical reign of the Bourbon family in Spain, many Spanish intellectuals during the Enlightenment strived to carve out a parallel Spanish identity. The question was, what exactly is Spain? An open-ended question that begged the next question, what are our symbols and what text certifies our language? In the innovative 18th century, the liberal intellectuals, the eruditos and the hombres de bien, were responsible for the massive publication of the first Spanish dictionary by the Real Academia Española. This is one of my favorite images talking about the 18th century because we have here the image of fire, and the fire here is purified, and also I think satirically to burn those French words that were plaguing the Spanish language. Limpia fija y da esplendor. 1739, this was a 14-year project called the Autoridades, aiming to cleanse the Spanish language from all French influence. There was an intense desire to eliminate the influence of French words in 18th century, and as we know, in American English, we too often use French phrases like s'il vous plaît, bon appétit, rendezvous, déjà vu. The first Spanish national anthem The himno nacional was adopted in the 18th century. This music was an attempt to mirror Spanishness with the divisive culture of the 1700s. Spain's national flag was also adopted in 1785, and its designers attempted to create a visual symbol of Spanish identity, culture, and values. And finally, the Academia de Buen Gusto, it's really hard to translate this one, the Academy of Good Taste, doesn't sound quite right, was created in part to suggest to Spaniards just what Spanishness was exactly. What made a Spaniard a Spaniard? The dictionary, the music, the national flag, and the Good Taste Bureau, Academia de Buen Gusto, were all attempts to construct a national identity during the important 18th century. About 25 years ago, my dissertation advisor said to me one Friday afternoon in Philadelphia, he said to me, "Hey Scott, I'd like to give you a copy of a text written by a virtually unknown author named Francisco Gutierrez de los Rios, and the name of his text is El Hombre Práctico." This is the book. This book, written in 1680, so really at the very, very beginnings of the 18th century aesthetic, was published in 1686 in Brussels. It would have been very difficult to publish this type of text in Spain. This collection of 61 essays was until about 25 years ago virtually unheard of until my dissertation advisor found a first edition in a private library near Sevilla. The author, Gutierrez de los Rios, was the third count of a small town called Fernan Núñez, and he spent his resources not on palaces, houses, or properties, but rather on his travels to France, England, and Germany, and the purchase of innovative books written in 18th century Europe. He's one of my heroes because instead of spending his resources on lavish palaces or land, he traveled and purchased texts. I tell many of my students that one important key to intellectual enrichment is proficiency in a second language or a third language. Learning languages opens doors to new ways of looking at the world and ourselves and reflecting on what all of this means. The author of the Hombre Práctico writes an innovative philosophical text about the human intellect, mental capacity, and mankind's ability to look at our world scientifically and suggest practical solutions to everyday problems. In other words, Francisco Gutierrez de los Rios can be considered now as perhaps the first Spanish Enlightenment writer, because the Hombre Práctico essays suggest that answers regarding social progress, intellectual growth, and the betterment of the soul relies not on spiritual entities or institutions, but rather in the power of the mind, the ability to trust oneself, and our ability to reflect and think using our five senses, to explore new roads towards social progress. Of course, during the Spanish Inquisition, which continued in the 18th century, the Hombre Práctico text was strictly prohibited in Spain, and for that reason, it was published outside Spain's borders. The first essay of the collection focuses on the importance of parents in the development of child education. And this was something that I think Pedro and I briefly discussed before this talk, was how do you even approach the question of language with children? Parents have an enormous decision in which language will we use with our children. This author suggests that social progress in Spain depends not on the state, not on the church, but rather on the role of the liberal-minded and educated parent who should take the responsibility to educate their offspring. This text is innovative in 18th century Spain because the idea of parents participating in the liberal education of their children is unheard of at that time. Although published at the very end of the 17th century, we can classify this text intellectually as the first Enlightenment essay collection in Spain. Today, an electronic copy of this original book of essays is accessible to the general public. If we search this text in Google, you can find a PDF of all essays. So I am so enthusiastic about this text. Just looking at the titles of the 61 essays shows us what our author was thinking about at the beginning of the Enlightenment. Some of the topics explored in this book of essays include the capacity of the human intellect, family responsibility, pedagogy, physical exercise, importance of learning languages, medicine, fear, virtue, career paths, hobbies, knowledge, passion, courtesy, uncertainty, fidelity, truth, happiness, marriage, conversation, false appearances, and of course, death. The essays, written by Gutierrez de los Rios, covers most of our big questions in life. The most interesting ones to me, personally, as a specialist in the Enlightenment, include uncertainty, curiosity, creativity, pragmaticism, and the human capacity to find solutions. All of these themes in this Enlightenment text remind me of why I am so moved by the humanities today. We are celebrating the humanities in many universities these days because we're under attack. And this book of essays reminds us of why the humanities are so important. Texts like these allow us to reflect on big questions. That is, they allow us to reflect on so many questions and doubts that we might have about what all of this means. The 55th essay, so towards the end of the book, we have an essay about happiness. Aren't we all looking for happiness? This is a very interesting essay to me, and I think my students love to read this, especially in today's world. I think today's youth are in crisis, and social media is not helping. A large part of the essay focuses on how relying on trusting our intellect and reaching ideals and accomplishing goals can help us with issues of self-esteem and happiness. While the essay here on happiness suggests that self-reliance, self-independence, and self-discovery are key to achieving happiness, ultimate happiness cannot be achieved without considering the eternity of life after death. Otherwise, the author claims that the human experience would resemble a boat at sea without a rudder. So we are reminded that these essays, while focusing on the development of the human intellect, also recognize a certain spirituality, eternity, and afterlife. This text has been in print for just over 25 years, and hopefully El Hombre Práctico will become more of a staple in the curriculum of 18th century Spanish literature. And to continue with the previous analogy, if the Hombre Práctico text had an Instagram page, I think it would now have millions of followers. Another essay worth mentioning in the Hombre Práctico text is essay number 53, which is entitled Patria. This essay suggests that any person striving to understand themselves and their identity, as well as their intellectual capacity, should learn languages and travel to other countries. And there are a few people in this room who could probably reiterate the importance of travel and learning languages and how that opens the mind and doors to new possibilities. The ability to speak another language and the experiences of knowing other cultures empowers a person to not only understand how other people communicate and how other people live, but this knowledge and these experiences also allow us to better understand who we are and in which culture we exist. Knowing the other helps us know ourselves, and these reflections in the essays of Gutierrez de los Rios demonstrate his modernity and his appreciation of the humanities. Our multilingual author reminds me of other pivotal authors of 18th century Spain who later became pioneers in Enlightenment thought. Other multilingual and well-traveled authors of this time include José de Cadalso, Ignacio de Luzon, and of course Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, and many more. The key idea here is that knowing the other the other from a different culture, is a gateway not only to knowing our diverse world, but also a way to develop human intellect and our own identity. One more 18th century Spanish writer worth mentioning in this context is the monk Benito Jerónimo Feijó, who in 1739 published the book of essays entitled Teatro Crítico Universal. The text is called Teatro Crítico, but it's actually a book of essays. It's not a book of theater. Now, one of the essays in this 18th century text by Feijó is a study of the intellectual capacity, not of men, but more specifically of women. The essay is entitled Defense of Women, Defensa de las Mujeres, and this is the book. And to my knowledge, it may be the first philosophical text in 18th century Spain that argues the intellectual capacity of women is equal, if not superior, to men's. So we have to remember the originality and modernity of this essay, written by a monk in the 18th century, a text defending the intellectual capacity of women. Feijó argues that while Spain is a culture dominated by a patriarchal society and sexist values, women have the intellectual capacity to serve in more challenging capacities. The most surprising aspect of this 1739 essay is that this monk of the northern part of Spain, Asturias, we have Asturias in the house. This was not planned. Feijó writes in a very conservative society and attempts to challenge popular thought and conventional perspectives of the intellectual capacity of Spanish women, and all women for that matter. The 18th century Enlightenment in Spain, then, is surprising to many readers, or it's for Instagram followers, because we can also find innovative arguments regarding the sexes and the concept of gender equality in a very conservative and patriarchal culture. This writer, Feijó, reminds me why I have such an affinity for the Spanish Enlightenment. We now can locate writers previously overlooked who demonstrate the capacity to see beyond conventional thought of that time. And in the field of 18th century Spanish theater, the author, this image is a little blurry, sorry. Leandro Fernández Moratín publishes a play called El Sí de las Niñas, which challenges the fact that Spanish women during the 18th century had little or no say in their marriage options. This Enlightenment author, like Feijó, argues for women's rights at a time when the Inquisition conditioned popular culture values and thought. The Enlightenment in Spain was a time when liberal thought began to break down conventional cultural barriers. But perhaps the real rock star of the 18th century is my favorite, José de Cadalso, a dynamic and insightful poet, novelist, essayist, and military figure. For the first time in the 18th century, challenged readers to rethink how we perceive reality and everyday experiences. Cadalso, who was a privileged young writer, decided to take advantage of his family's resources, and again, he, like other authors mentioned in this presentation, decided to use his resources and travel to Europe, study English, Latin, French, purchase innovative European texts during the Enlightenment, and thankfully for Spanish readers, Cadalso returned to Spain and shared his new philosophical ideas within fictitious and entertaining literary texts, of course in Spanish. So Cadalso is another pioneer, and Spaniards should be very thankful to writers like this because they use their resources to enrich their minds and their fellow Spaniards in the 18th century. One adventurous book that Cadalso purchased in his travels was Oliver Goldsmith's Citizen of the World, a fictitious epistolary novel about the benefits of travel, languages, and experiencing new cultures and questioning perceptions of reality. In his 1774 epistolary novel entitled The Moroccan Letters, or Cartas Marruecas, Cadalso imagines a fictitious world in which three characters exchange letters about their individual perceptions of 18th century Spanish culture. In this novel, each of the three letter writers offer their impressions of the same reality. We, the readers of his book, must pick up the pieces, organize the letters, and act like detectives and form our own opinion of what Spanish culture must really be like. Three characters, three perspectives, and the reader must put it all together just like a puzzle. This innovative novelistic structure mimics the chaotic world in which we all live. And isn't that the truth? What is real in today's world? We need to question reality, ask if this text is real, fake news. It's all happening again. Rarely do we see an introduction, a body, and a clear ending in our real life experiences. Many times, we enter environments in contemporary culture with little or piecemeal knowledge, and we must form our own opinion based on information and data that we may or may not have. Cadalso also creates a text that mirrors reality of the 21st century. Cadalso is truly an Enlightenment writer and innovative novelist that questions linearity and conventional novelistic structure to mimic what reality is really like. Cadalso, the superstar of Enlightenment literature, does give credit to Miguel de Cervantes, the true pioneer of the modern European novel. So Cadalso doesn't pretend to be the greatest Spanish novelist, but he does suggest that his novel is even more of an accurate mirroring of human experience. Like our own authors mentioned today, Cadalso benefits from a knowledge of languages, cultures, science, and Enlightenment philosophy. He produces a more innovative and accurate depiction of human experiences. Now, while the main characters in Don Quixote disagree on what those windmills really are, Cadalso's characters even struggle to trust language. And they clearly depict a very contemporary vision of what all of this means and what it could represent. And I feel the same way as Cadalso when I read digital text. Is this real? In Cadalso's novel, language is questioned. One character in particular, his name is Nuño Núñez. He even struggles to find the words to express his own frustration. He can't find the words to express what he feels. Cadalso seems to suggest that even language, the words we use, are slippery and questionable as symbols of communication. Cadalso is perhaps the most advanced Enlightenment thinker and writer because language, the vehicle for crystallizing thought, is questioned as a reliable vehicle to express our ideas. So, on that note, I hope my words were a reliable vehicle to express how innovative the Spanish Enlightenment really is. Thank you.